We've talked about a lot of the theory of context and using it with some examples. And in the previous lesson, we made a little bit of a brush your teeth real world application. So let's see if we can put the two together. Let's see if we can use some of our new context knowledge in the Brush Your Teeth app. So I'm going to clear down the environment stack and associated code that we've got here. And here's our getting started stack, which we had commented out. So I'm going to pop that back in. And then let's just go and have a look at the file again so we can see what it does. So we have our constructor, which we're then using to create an event bridge rule. And that's done in a private method just to keep the constructor a little bit smaller. Then we're making a Lambda function, again handled by a private method. So we use the Node.js function to handle things like transpilation and bundling. We were required to add a permission for SES because it sends an email. So we did that here, again using a method on the L2 construct, the Node.js function. And then we return that function back so that the constructor can join the two together. Uses the add target method on our event bridge rule, provides it with a Lambda function, which is a kind of target here. If we go and have a look at the imports, there's the AWS events targets, and then it pops our Lambda function in. So that's our basic application as it stands. Now at the moment, this is named with the auto-generated resource names that are produced by CloudFormation, and those resource names are going to be a combination of some of the strings and bits and pieces from CDK, the stack names, and some other bits and pieces. And you might think, well, what would this look like if we wanted to name it manually? If we wanted to have fixed names for, say, the Lambda function rather than the auto-generated ones. And we've got a lesson that talks about naming and why you would or wouldn't want to go with that kind of naming. So it's really something for you to think over for your team and context and decide if it's appropriate. But for the argument's sake and for using a bit of context, we're going to do that here. So I'll pop up to the top level, and you can see at the moment the log level we've got here is info, but it's hard coded as info as a string. And let's assume that we might want to change that. Maybe in one account or one region we are doing some development, and so we want a more verbose log level. Maybe in another region we just want a notification of any warnings or errors, for example. In our cdk.context.json, we've still got some of the old data which we're not going to use anymore. So I'm just going to manually clear that out to be an empty object. But remember, we could use the -- clear option of the CDK context command to do that if we'd like. And then we're going to pop over to cdk.json and we're going to adapt what we've got here to work with our brush your teeth example. So we're going to start off by trying to find the environment name for the account we're in. So let's start off with a new context key here, and we're going to use the format where we've got the thing we're looking up at the top, and then we're going to break that down by account ID and then region. So let's do the environment, and then we're going to have our account ID, which is the same as we had before, and then we're going to assume that Frankfurt is going to be our staging environment, and and then EU West 1 or Ireland is going to be our production environment. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing again for a log level, but actually I think this time let's make that slightly different. Let's use the syntax we had here where we're using a more simple string value with delimiters. So I'll pop in the account ID there, and then we're going to say that in EU West 1, EU West 1, which is our production environment, we're going to make this log level error. And actually I forgot to change the environment here, so that could be something like log level. Now, I'm by no means saying that you should only have error level logs enabled in production, but we're just using that as a little bit of an example. So we've got two different formats here. We've got one where we are passing through the environment name based on the key at the top, and that's changing based on the account and region. And then we've got another one where we are using a simple string key and having the log level in, and that's so that we're going to be able to change that and override it. So let's pop back to the bin folder where the stack's been defined, and we're going to put the settings into the stack here just as normal objects, just as normal keys and normal objects, and we're doing that to make the stack easy to test and to keep some of this context logic out of the stack itself, out of those lower layers, because it's a little bit easier to reason about. If you've got this one file here with most of the stuff in, It gets read in one place at the application's entry point, if you like, and then the values are just passed around normally. You don't have to go several layers deep into a construct to find where it's pulling out a particular context value. So let's start off by looking up the account and region, just like we did before. And we're going to do that because we have to use those as keys when we're looking up the context items. So let's say we're going to have the CDK default account. And then our region is going to be CDK default region. And then WebStorm's very conveniently marked that these are string or undefined because it doesn't necessarily have environment variable values set. User doesn't have to provide them. And in this case, we know they're getting specified by CDK or sent to us via CDK, but TypeScript doesn't know that. So let's just add in a little bit of validation. If we say if we don't have the environment or we don't have the region, oops, I keep writing action rather than account. Then we're going to throw a new error and say you must specify a CDK default account and a CDK default region. Lovely. And then by the time we get down here, account is now a string rather than a string or undefined that it was at the top. So we've got those values set. Let's find our log level. And for the log level, we weren't using that nested structure. We were just using the simple string keys with delimiter. So we're going to do the app.node.tryGetContext, and then we're going to start it off with our key, which is going to be, you can use the organization or similar prefix if you choose. And then this is going to be log, is it log level in camel case? Did I put it like that? Yeah, I did. And then the account, and then the region. And we're actually going to assume that you don't necessarily have this value, so we'll allow the specification of a default, which is going to be debug. Lovely. And then once we've got our log level, let's finish it off with the environment. And we'll do the same again, try get context. And this time it is the nested structure. So we want to look up the environment, and then it's going to be keyed by account. Whoops. And then it's going to be keyed by region. And then we can use those two values in our construct. So let's just pass in log level and let's pass in environment. And we can pop to the stack itself. We can see that the log level parameter or key is already available here. And we can add another one for the environment. And then in our constructor here, we could set up a resource prefix. And let's say this is going to be brush your teeth, and then the environment name, sorry, that should be props.environment. And then let's have a dash. And then we can pass the resource prefix into our two methods here. So let's have that end as a string. And then you can see for the event rule properties what we can specify there. So let's go into rule, let's look at rule props. We have enabled, scheduled, targets, and event bus. So actually we don't need a name for the event rules. That's fine, that can go. Let's take that out. And then let's go and look at the Lambda function. I know for Lambda function we'll definitely have a function name here. So that could be, again, passed in as a argument to this method. And we could say resource prefix dash, let's call this the reminder. Whoops, and I've messed up the syntax there. So let me fix that string interpolation. There we go. I think we do have a trailing dash already in our resource prefix, so I don't think we need that one in the middle. So we're making the resource name manually because we've chosen to for this use case. We're using that resource prefix, and that resource prefix is taking in the environment element from our props, and the props is being populated with the context. So one of the challenges with setting the physical names here is that these constructs like the Node.js function might produce multiple resources, and we would have to override the names of those resources as well. So one of these examples is the IAM role. And as you can see, we've got the minified source code. So I'm just going to format that so we can have a look at it. And then we're in Lambda function, aren't we? There we go. And let's look at the Lambda function source code and let's format that. Obviously, we could look at this in the documentation if we prefer. And if we scroll down to the constructor, then we have a bit of setup followed by the production of a role. So this role here isn't having the role name property passed in, and there's no provision for us to pass a role name property in. So it's going to get the default generated name. And to make our own one, we would actually have to replace the functionality that CDK is doing. So it's saying, well, you can either pass in a role with props.role, or we'll make one. If we make one, it's made with a particular assumption policy, which is great because that's what we want, lambda.amazonaws.com. However, it's also getting managed policies, which is put up here for us. So we, again, would have to replicate this logic to make sure the role that we produce is the same as the one that Lambda produces. So let's have a go at that. Let's take the role setup here. Let's pop back to our stack. And we can say this is called role. And you can see that this is using the prefix here where the IAM package has been imported in alias. So if I scroll up to the imports, you can see that that's actually going to be asterisk as. Whoops, I need to separate that into a separate line. And for all the course so far, I've been using it without the prefix, but I appreciate that this is present in a lot of examples and you may choose to do that. So we'll show it off here. And then for managed policies, we need an array of these. And then let's go and have a look at what's being done in CDK. And that is the basic execution policy. And then if we're in a VPC, we get the VPC one. So we're not in a VPC in this case. So we're just going to have the basic execution policy. And we'll pop that in there. So we've made our role, but we haven't set up the override name, if you like, or the physical name. So let's set role name, and we can do, again, resource prefix, and then we could just call it reminder. Then we've got to pass in that role to the Lambda function. Okay, let's do a synth and see what we get. And again, we're going to redirect that into a template.yaml. So if I lop off these bits at the top from npm, we can see we've got an event rule which doesn't have a name, so that's all fine and happy. Then we've got a Lambda permission, again, which those don't have names themselves. We have an IAM role, which should have a name. Let's see the role name there. Yep, so it's brush your teeth production reminder. And then the IAM policy. And the policies themselves, again, are going to have a name. I don't think it's worth us going and digging in and changing this as part of this example. Obviously, if you really wanted everything to have a physical name that you know and like, then sure, you'd have to do that. But we'll leave that policy for now, for the sake of time. And then our Lambda function here is called brush your teeth production reminder. So let's have a look what happens if we change region. So at the moment, let's see what region I've got as an override. So, okay, no override set, so it's using what's in the profile. So let's change it over to Frankfurt. And let's run another synth. Let's clear off the npm stuff at the top and find our resources again. So we have the IAM role, which is now brush your teeth staging reminder. We have the Lambda function, which is now brush your teeth staging reminder. And actually, if we look at the log level, now are we using the log level or have we not passed that in yet? Let's go and have a look at where that log level is, see where it's gotten to. Okay, let's add that in. So I'm going to pass the log level into the Lambda function creation function or method. So let's call that prop start log level, give that a bit of a format. Then the method's now complaining because it doesn't take that second argument, so let's add that in as our log level. Pop that in as a string there, and let's go and create the environment variables. So we'll have our environment section. We'll call it log underscore level, and that's going to be log level, like so. All right, let's give that another synth now that we're passing the log level all the way through and making it into an environment variable. So if we find our Lambda function, we've now got two environment variables, one that comes by default for the AWS SDK, and then another one for log level being debug. Now you can see that it's debug because if we look in our CDK context here, we only have a value for Ireland for EU West 1, and then if we look at the code that is accessing that context variable, it's trying to look it up, and then if it doesn't find it, it will use the default debug. So we could switch over to the different region and see that become error, or because we're using this simple string format here, rather than a nested object or richer type, we can pass in an override. So let's do -- context. We can use a nice little example, from here, save us some typing, pop it in for EU Central 1, and then say that, instead of debug, we're going to have info. So let's run that again. We get our template, and then here's log level of info. And if we swap the regions back over by removing our AWS region environment variable, so we go back to what's in my profile, which is Ireland, we can run the synth again, generate the template, and see that it's now error, which is what's been specified in that context value. So as a bit of a recap, we had a play with custom naming of resources just to try it out, and there's a lesson on that if you want to know whether you do or don't want to use naming. We specified the account and region based on these two CDK environment variables, which we don't have to provide. CDK populates them for us. We had a quick check on their type to make sure they are present, and then we used that account and region as part of the context key or to look up a value from within something we get from the context. We demonstrated two approaches, one using a simple string, which is much easier to override, and one which is using a nested object, which personally I find easier to use, especially if you've got lots and lots of context items. We did this in the app level right at the top to avoid this logic leaking into many levels of constructs and potentially getting a bit hard to reason about, see where the values were coming from. We passed them in just as normal JSON objects or JSON values, and then we use those in the production of some resources, either to specify the manual name for the resource getting created, or in this case for an environment variable. And then just as a recap on the roles section here, we saw that the level 2 construct is creating some resources for us, not just the kind of primary resource. The main resource is our Lambda function, but there are other things getting made. And so we read the source code to understand what is getting made. We looked at the code paths that is flowing through, decided that to have a role with a custom name, we would have to make our own. We couldn't say press in an override. And we did that. We replicated the functionality of the CDK level 2 construct by adding this manage policy here and the assumption policy that it was using. And then we passed it in and we used synth to verify what was in the template and to see what we'd achieved. And there's adapting our brush your teeth example for context.